Education 2030 and fostering global citizenship education. It is important to recognize that we have 17 goals of sustainable development. Today, I will discuss why we need global citizenship education and why we need it now, which pertains to the goal 4, or quality of education. What are the enable requirements for global citizenship education? I think it is very important to clarify what is global citizenship education. And many scholars have asked themselves, is that an abstraction or a framework for action? Without entering into a long discussion of what it is and what it is not, I think we should accept the decision of UNESCO to call it a framework for action. But when you talk about citizenship education and you talk about citizenship, you have to realize that they are bare essentials. In other terms, economic citizenship cannot be accomplished without access to a job, education, medical care, housing, retraining over the lifetime of an individual. These bare essentials, or civic minimums, are a precondition for the establishment of a full citizenship. There are several principles. Here you have them listed in different order, but I think I will just emphasize 2 or 3. First, the respect for human rights. The human rights regime is the model that has been accepted worldwide. The countries of the world have subscribed to it, and with this model we have a basic bedrock of citizenship. But then, of course, planetarian citizenship and sustainability. It is absolutely essential that when we look at citizenship, we look at the planet, which requires a special attention. It's our only home. We have to protect it. And it's essential that we allow the planet to evolve. We have to bring the background into the foreground. There are several agents, the international system, NGOs, social movements, federal governments, local government, regional government, the school system, formal educational systems. All of these could be considered agents in enabling requirements for citizenship. Of course, we have to pay attention to teaching methods. And I would like to say only one element and move on. We need a really cultural sensitive pedagogy, and one that could engage citizenship building with a culture of peace. I will go back to a culture of peace in a few minutes. And finally, at this level of complexity, we do need that the educational systems recognize the importance of global citizenship education. There are several missing links, and those are elements that need to be addressed, and they cannot be ignored, and they must be confronted. The first one is the question of human rights tensions. There are 2 great enemies, if you put it in this term, of global citizenship education. On the one hand, rabid nationalism. On the other hand, religious radicalism. Both of them assume that citizenship can only define in the terms that they define it. That is, as a nationalistic or hyper-nationalistic sense, or in a model of religious radicalism that do not accept any conversation, any dialogue about the principles of the canon. All those 2, in my view, constitute the element that opposes human rights as a universal citizenship. The other element is the tension between social justice, globalism. Globalism is not only globalization, it is a globalization controlled by multinational corporations and countries who try to control the world. Social justice is the attempt to make this world a better world. There is a tremendous tension between globalism and social justice occurring in the context of multiple globalizations today. I emphasize planetarian citizenship, and we need to identify social justice for the planet. I was talking to Paulo Freire in his house in Sao Paulo many years ago, before he passed away. And he said to us and to other friends, Carlos, I should have spoken about the planet in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. There is a missing chapter in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it's eco-pedagogy, how we can use education to protect the environment. Migration continues to be a most important issue of citizenship, and I would like to submit to you that the rights of immigrants are not fully encapsulated in human rights. Of course, we have the knowledge society, and the knowledge society is connected with the network society. One of the elements that articulate global citizenship now is the need to promote a model of knowledge that helps capital accumulation, political legitimation, but at the same time democracy. And that could happen in the context of a network society where everything seems to be interconnected with each other. Therefore, the idea of the traditional 18th, 19th century notion of citizenship as encapsulated within a territory by a nation state is being quickly evaporating. And finally, we have to see the role of education in preventing violent extremism. Those are very serious issues that are inviting us to rethink the same concept of citizenship, and that requires that global citizenship intervenes actively in finding ways to prevent violent extremism. Now, there are tensions, there are contradictions, there are conundrums. The first one is the question of similarities and differences. I don't think this is the moment to begin to discuss exactly how you define global citizenship, but it is certainly connected with terms like global education, civic education, global citizenship education, planetarian citizenship. Some people have argued that global citizenship education is civic education of the 21st century. Maybe so. But the point I'm trying to make is the discussion about terminology is less relevant. The importance here is to defend a framework for action. And here then we have the question of multiple globalizations. In my own work, I have defined several phases of globalization. Just to give you an idea, we have the neoliberal globalization, the dominant top-down model that is impacting the life of all of us, our families, our communities, our nations, our regions, the world altogether. But then, of course, any action has, by implication, and any action has a reaction. So you have the anti-globalization movement. This has been quite active, and we began the century with the first death of the anti-globalization movement in Genoa, when a militant against globalization was killed by the police in Italy, Genoa. Then we have hybrid cultures. If there is a trademark of contemporary globalizations, is this element of diversity, and particularly hybrid cultures, when a number of things that were invented in a particular part or created in a particular part of the world, such as hip-hop in the Bronx more than 70 years ago, now has different expressions of Japanese hip-hop, of Korean hip-hop, Indian hip-hop, etc. Human rights and the human rights regime is another model of globalization, challenging some of the most brutal and violent models of globalization that still exist, and providing a bedrock for a new model of citizenship worldwide. And of course, we have the issue of the war against terrorism and the terrorist model that, in a way, constitute two other phases of globalization. The question of measurement and metrics is a very important question, and it's a great challenge for everything we do in education, more so when we look at citizenship building. How you measure improvements in citizenship building? How you measure the praxis that come out of teaching and learning global citizenship education? This is one of the topics that is beginning to take extraordinary importance in the context of UNESCO and other areas, and it's an area that we are investigating with several colleagues. Of course, we are facing the dilemma of liberal democracies. In one of my books, Education, Democracy, and Multiculturalism, Dilemmas of Citizenship in the Global World, I have identified different stages of understanding the transition from the subject to the king, in which the king has absolute power, to the citizens of the nation state, in which the citizen now emerge with some autonomy, rights and responsibilities. And we are moving now into a model of global citizenship that goes beyond the nation state. Some people argue that the nation state has vanishes or is losing its power, and there is a bit of that, while at the same time globalization will never exist without the presence of nation states. What is the added value of global citizenship education? I already showed the tension with nationalism and with religious fundamentalism. But what I will say is this: we cannot even begin to think about global citizenship unless we know that global citizenship will add value to national, regional, local, community citizenship. And there are multiple citizenships, but the question of adding value is important because a perception that is quite pervasive now is that citizenship has always been a work in progress. In other terms, citizenship has not been fully accomplished. And we are facing all sorts of problems all over the world in terms of creation of citizenship, creation of national unity, even the workings of democracy in the context of capitalism. Therefore, this question of value added is a precondition for global citizenship to take hold. To do that, we have to decouple the human rights regimes or the human rights politics from imperialism. I gave you here several examples: the Gulf War, the former Yugoslavian War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, Rwanda, currently Syria. It is being proven over and over again that genocide takes place in areas in which the dominant power of the war don't have particular interest to defend. And therefore, places like Rwanda, in less than a year, more than 500,000 people were assassinated, murdered by groups, ethnics, who oppose them. And there was virtually no intervention of the main powers. The same discussion about Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. Partnership with social movements is an option, and an important one, to establish a worldwide model of global citizenship education. Social movements are now becoming transnational, and they're having a much more important presence in the construction of citizenship. But mind you, take into account that there is a citizenship depth of social movements. Social movements have been able to challenge the state, have been able to veto initiatives, but have not yet been able to put forward a unified model of transnational global citizenship that could be endorsed by most progressive social movements. And this could be seen as a new social compact that we can definitely identify in the world. Of course, there are issues that are very difficult to resolve, and global citizenship education may not resolve all of them. For instance, the tension between individual rights and cultural rights. The question of human rights education is a question based on a set of premises which are shared, accepted immediately after the Second World War. But several of those premises contradict long-standing cultural rights traditions, some of them going 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. And there is a tremendous tension, particularly when you look at the question of gender, in which the human rights regime will defend the right of women to be treated as full citizens, and then in some traditions, which I will not name, they are very well known, women are not fully incorporated into the polity. But what can and cannot be reconciled? I personally think that it's very difficult to reconcile the linguistic differences. There are terminology issues in all the different languages which don't have an adequate incorporation vis-a-vis the other language. We have epistemological differences. People are talking about the epistemologies of the North, epistemologies of the South. This is a very important conversation, and my argument has been in more than one of my books that you need to consider these tensions between epistemologies and try to resolve it moving into a social epistemology in which all the questions have been incorporated, particularly the question of post-colonialism. A great deal of the dilemmas of citizenship today has been created by colonialism, its ability to take control and oppress people, nationalities, ethnias, races, tribes, reorganizing the world at their own pleasure and taking advantage of resources that were not theirs. The post-colonial tradition is one of the most important traditions that we need to endorse if we are going to really think of global citizenship education in the ways that is being considered internationally. The religious differences are obviously very different among themselves. The religions are different. Some of them have the same origin, like the Abrahamic traditions, but they keep debating themselves in terms of their principles. There is an attempt, and a very valid one, to create an interfaith dialogue, and dialogue continues to be one of the great topics for global citizenship education. Community ownership differences, of course, because community themselves are fighting to preserve their identities. Then, of course, the differential impacts of the model of the state and welfare regime all over the world. When people talk about the welfare regime or the welfare state, we are not talking about the same model of the state. The Scandinavian states are different than the liberal welfare state, and so on. This may be seen as an academic technicality, but it's not. The way in which the state helps create distribution of resources changes dramatically according to the tradition in which the welfare state is built. And of course, I would like to emphasize the importance of the democratic state. Today, we are living in a moment in which people talk about rich societies, and there is a very serious criticism of democracy. There is essentially a perception that democracy is not working as it should be, and there are attempts to undermine democracy. These attempts are usually connected with authoritarian perspectives, and I will emphasize that without a democratic state, we cannot have a democracy. So why global citizenship and why now? Some people have argued, I will insist in this definition, that it's an intervention in search of a theory. Since I have said that at the moment, I'm not very concerned what kind of theory we can use, but I'm concerned to use this concept as part of a framework for action. I will emphasize that as an intervention is taking a main place in the context of the world system, and particularly when you look at questions of security and peace. Now, as a form of intervention is searching for a theory and agency of implementation, because the world is becoming increasingly interdependent and diverse, and its borders more porous. There is a deterritorialization of citizenship practices and identities, and of discourses about loyalty and alliance. So we are in a very fluid period of the world. The transitions are many. The borders are being evaporating. So we need then a model of global democratic multicultural citizenship without a multicultural tradition that address the questions about identity and diversity together. We will not be able to create a model of international model of global citizenship education. And of course, cultural diversity is at the heart of this conversation. But also, as I emphasize, global democratic multicultural citizenship I will emphasize once again that global citizens should add value to national citizenship, because there is an expansion of a universalistic claim of world solidarity, but it rests on the concept of cosmopolitan citizenship. There are several forms of global citizenship already being implemented. Greenpeace represents a defense of the environment that was well beyond just a social movement. It's an attempt to create an ethics of implementation of action that does not affect our planet. And therefore, many of the great militants of Greenpeace, as a good example, are global citizens themselves. They are not looking at a particular locality. They are looking at the whole globe as their own house. And finally, the question of cosmopolitan democracies. I said that there is a crisis of democracy, and one of the ways in which we can solve that crisis is to think of cosmopolitan democracies. But here we have one of the most fascinating and difficult dilemmas presented to us by Kant. Kant asked himself, trying to understand this paradox of democracy, how can we have an international system that is democratic when the units of the system are not themselves democratic? But at the same time, how can we have a unit of the system being democratic when the overall international system, it is not? This paradox of democracy is very important to be addressed when we are going to talk about global citizenship education. Let me offer you a very simple distinction. There are two elements that need to be considered simultaneously when we talk about citizenship. It's not only about a status role. It is not only about rights and obligations. It is about civic minimums, which means, as T.H. Marshall defined more than 65 years ago, ultimately rest on material basis. How could we ask people to be loyal citizens, to be in solidarity with the rest of us when they don't have a basic premise of survival? When there are people like in Egypt today and in other places of the world, when 1/7, that is 1 billion of the 7+ billion that we are on this earth, are living with less than $2 a day. How we can ask them to be good citizens? We need to provide these basic premises or civic minimums. But then, civic virtues. I'm using the work of American scholar Amy Gutman, which has argued that education for citizenship should focus on the justification of rights rather than responsibilities. And at the same time, that a school should foster, and here you have a list, general virtues, social virtues, economic virtues, political virtues. Identity is a central component of our struggle to become human. Understanding our own identity is one of the most difficult parts of our own life. Understanding the identity of others is part of this process. Pride, to be proud of yourself, pride itself is not bad. We need to be proud of what we do, of our culture, our civilizations, our religion. But prejudice could emerge out of a misunderstanding of pride. Pride and prejudice sometimes go together. My goal will be to understand civic virtues that enhance the good components of being proud of yourself, of your culture, of your region, or your nationality, and at the same time avoid the prejudicial understanding of others. So I see global citizenship education as being marked by understanding of global ties, relations and connections, and a commitment to the collective good. Therefore, we need to think of global commons. Here I offer you the idea of what is a global common. There are three basic propositions that I think help us understand why we need today, now, global citizenship. The first one is that the planet is our only home and we have to protect it through a global citizenship education development which is sustainable, it moves from diagnosis and denunciation into action and policy implementation. Global citizenship education as planetarian citizenship. The second one is the idea that global peace is an intangible cultural good of humanity with immaterial value. Global peace is a treasure of humanity. What we are discovering now is that the old Greek adage that at time of peace the children buried the parent, and at time of war the parents buried the children. The natural way of life is that the parents are buried by their children, and peace is a condition for that to happen. Finally, our third global commons is predicated on the need to find ways that people who are all equal manage to live together democratically in an ever-growing diverse world, seeking to fulfill their individual and cultural interests, and achieving their inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This third global commons should be shared with the whole humanity. So, speaking of the role of the UNESCO chair in global learning and global citizenship education that I have the honor to occupy at UCLA, I would like to present you with some of these principles in a whole understanding of what we need to do today.
In February 2016, the UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Studies celebrated the establishment of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization Chair in Global Learning and Global Citizenship Education. Global citizenship education provides global answers to global and local problems. Putting every child in school, improving the quality of learning, and fostering global citizenship are the three basic principles of the Global Education First initiative.
As inaugural UNESCO UCLA Chair in Global Learning and Global Citizenship Education, I'm working to promote the cooperation between academic institutions, governments, and communities on the basis of global commons, the preservation of our planet through sustainable development education and global citizenship education, promoting a culture of global peace, and making sure that everyone has an opportunity to learn and be safe. Fostering democratic values, seeking to fulfill the individual and collective cultural interests, while preserving the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Together, we can change the way in which we look at education. Global citizenship education will contribute to solve the prevailing inequality in our world.
Global citizenship education will provide us with the key to a more just, peaceful, tolerant, and inclusive world.